and I'm Jim Notman. I'm the president of the Global Sustainability Network, also a sustainability development leader in the Performance Infrastructure Group, here at JCI. I'm going to let Herman Gyr, Lisa Friedman, fully introduce themselves as part of their presentation. As David said, we were originally going to have Herman and Lisa as part of our Earth Month speaker series. We had some technical issues with Teams. We had to reschedule, and so happy that we have them here with us today. Just as a quick how we got here, I met Herman and Lisa, I think it's within the last year, about a year ago, outside of Johnson Controls through my involvement with an organization called the Climate Reality Project. Through that, a mutual friend of both of ours connected us up, and we've basically been having regular conversations ever since then. I think that Herman and Lisa bring a real unique perspective on climate change and especially how we as employees, especially of a big company like Johnson Controls, and not just as individuals, really can help make the world a better place. And that sounds very rah-rah, but I think once you're done listening to the presentation, you'll have a real appreciation for that. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Herman and Lisa. It is all yours.
Fantastic. Well, it's a real treat to be here, finally, after trying so hard last time. And as Jim just said, we are going to try to, I'm just going to pull this up. We're going to try to provoke you a little bit to basically propose something that takes information we all have, we hear every day, and reframe it a little bit in a way that puts us what we call on another planet, that puts us in a different context to what we typically think about as we look at this climate crisis. And from that perspective, to see how that might mobilize certain actions we would otherwise probably not think about. So that was the invitation from Jim, is be somewhat provocative, open us up to another way to think about this problem, and here we are. So we're really looking forward to it. We're really particularly looking forward to it because you're Johnson Controls, and when you listen to your own CEO and chairman, George Oliver, he positions Johnson Control very clearly as a significant player in this moment in time. He positions that humanity has 7 years to cut global emissions by half. Right. Well, he believes that with the help of a company like Johnson Controls, or specifically with Johnson Controls, that can be accomplished ahead of schedule. Right. That there's a huge opportunity, that this is about taking action that is now urgent for the future of our planet. And it is now something that you must do. So that's a fantastic background for this kind of invitation. And we're going to try to frame, as I said, the reality in a way that mobilizes certain kind of actions now. So with that, Lisa, you want to talk a little bit about
I'll tell you a little bit about who we are, right? So Lisa Friedman and Herman Gyr, we're founders and also partners in EDG, which stands for Enterprise Development Group. We're based in Silicon Valley, but work around the world. And we tend to do three things we start doing business and organization strategy, but what you'll see later is we first look out into the world and see where the world's going and see the signals and see what are the urgent pushes about what needs to be done and what's the pull and the big opportunity. Then we work with innovation best practices once we're identifying this new strategic space that's emerging. How do we innovate and get all of our people wherever they are, in companies, in other companies, supply chains, industry ecosystems? How do we get people together to work together to innovate in the solutions we need in that new space? And then what's the future-driven leadership to make it happen? We work with all kinds of industries around the world, in the US and internationally. We've worked with a number of building and construction clients, like Kaiser for a decade, with some of the building groups going on there. We've worked with transportation, anything that moves, airlines, railroads, cars, electric motorcycles, all kinds of media companies, universities, grocery stores. We write a lot about what we do as we go along. The Global Innovation Science Handbook, they asked us, it's a 880-page textbook of an global innovation association. They wanted us to write the introduction at the beginning to do the overview of what was going to come. Dynamic enterprise, you'll see a little bit about what's in that. That's about the strategy and blueprints that we'll talk a little bit about. CoStar is about, because we're Silicon Valley, it's like how to pitch. How do you get your people to, once you know the space you want to innovate into, how do you get your people to come up with value propositions and good ideas and be able to describe them so that they can go get them funded and engaged? We're from Silicon Valley, which is a place where people like to start new stuff, and people come from around the world actually to meet some of the startups or to get funding or to help start new ventures.
Oops. So sort of a byline to our work is expand the possible. And I think you're going to sense that throughout this hour is how do we reorient ourselves to see where the possibilities are, to expand beyond what we think is possible. And all that work that Lisa just described, it was always about some kind of disruption, some kind of transformational pressure on the companies we worked with, and they would come to us and say, how can we turn this moment into something that generates a whole new energy, a whole new orientation for our company? And it's been an incredible ride. I mean, we've had an extreme fortune to be able to participate in these kind of really transformational moments. So.
And one of the perspectives that I think has really helped people know how big the challenge is of the moment is to really look at these eras that we've had throughout history, right? We know we've went from agricultural era to industrial to digital. When in an era, it's not just one company or another changing, but everything, the way everything's done changes from one era to the next. And now we're even moving from digital into hyper digital, where not just people, but everything can get smart and connected. And you certainly see that in your
with
buildings.
Digital twin buildings and sensors.
And where everything's connected, or predictive analytics, what's going to happen later. And so every industry now is starting to deal with what it means and to go into this new generation of what it means to have smart and connected everything.
So typically when we are called in, one of the main sort of orientations is to get everybody together to see, can we kind of join in a shared blueprint for the future, right?
So where's the world going? Whether we go there or not, the world is on the move. It is dynamic. And then it's who are we becoming in that new world? So those yellow circles at the right, it's not just what we're going to be offering and how we'll organize to offer it, but the who is something deeper. It's really, what are our core values? What are we about? What's our view of that future that we want to create together? And then that last piece is, and how do we get there together?
I mean, the latest thing that George Oliver wrote for Fortune magazine, I think really oriented Johnson Controls to that. The world is going in that direction. We have 7 years. Who are we going to be in that world? What is our claim? What is our license to operate kind of in that world? And I think it's very much in alignment with that. So very often, and we're going to encourage you to, in this moment, to work together with your teams to kind of map things out, to create these kind of environments where people together can share, hey, I've seen something, what does that mean to us? So
and now we can do these maps online as well, because groups are often in different places. So with Teams and with Zoom and any kind of other sorts of things, that you can actually see all of this online and hone in on what people are drawing. But the other thing is, if you look in the middle of this picture, you'll see these curves, right? There's a blue curve and a red curve. And that's where they're talking about the shift in the eras. And the presenters found some hats and put these on as part of their presentation. They're describing this to their leadership team. And so they're really saying they're at the top of the blue curve. They are the leaders in the world as it is now, knowing that the world's changing and there's a new era that's beginning, and they'll talk about the transition and what they want to create in that new world. So they have the old world and the new world in dialogue with each other to present this to their leaders.
So a lot of the work that happens in Silicon Valley and that we're going to suggest to all of you is to continuously see and interpret signals. We just talked about the fires in the east, from Canada coming down. What does that mean to us? Is that a signal that we ought to look at? How does that inform us about the disruptions and opportunities that come to us? And there's this sort of thing where maybe you're in the morning, in the shower in the morning, or you look at a piece of news and your mind goes, wait, what? What's this? So trust these moments. When you have a wait, what moment, just step into it and say, is that something I should talk to my team about? Is that something we should address? Should we talk over lunch about that? Talking to my family about it. We need to address these things because they're important signals, right? We talked earlier before the session about this, right? Canada is burning right now. Over 400 fires are happening up there. Many of them are out of control.
This is one of those what moments.
Well, and then the next wait what, of course, is that we talked about that. Many of you are in that environment right now, and we talked about the fact that when humans are in these kind of conditions, we do wake up. We kind of go, that feels apocalyptic. That feels profoundly different. And so we had that experience a few years back in California, right?
Right. So this was back in September of 2020.
Very much the same experience.
These were from fires that were 2.5 hours away from us. And
Yes.
and Herman had said earlier before we started that the word people would talk about to each other was, it just felt apocalyptic.
Yeah.
This is the middle of the day, and we've just never experienced anything like it, and it does something to us emotionally.
So then in San Francisco we have this, and in New York on the East Coast you have this as well. So this was actually a king tide, but it was a precursor, sort of a preview of, we hear these statistics that say, well, the ocean's going to rise by so many feet. That's what it's going to look like in San Francisco in the not very distant future. And we're looking at spending billions of dollars on basically building walls,
being seawalls along the whole bay in San Francisco.
There are already parts of the piers that are closed now because they are waiting for them to be basically hardened so that they can handle these kind of water things.
And it's happening all around the world. I think the photo on the upper right is quite moving with here's the subway where the guy's immersed in water.
Pakistan, you heard about that. A third of the country was flooded last year, and with all that means in terms of migration, with loss of life and livelihoods, remarkable kind of developments. Now in Arizona, this just came out a few days ago.
Right. So now Arizona has, some places get all the water, other places don't get enough. So Arizona is actually just announcing a limit to future home building in Arizona and Phoenix. Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the U.S., right, due to lack of groundwater.
And we have India, right, the hottest February. We have Greenland, the hottest in 1,000 years. It's it's melting 100 times faster than had been estimated. And what's happening is that the glaciers, from all the soot from these fires that we're seeing, there's snow on top of it. The snow melts away, and then that soot starts appearing. And this is a glacier. On the right, you see a glacier. And there's no more albedo effect, right? It no longer reflects any light. It becomes this hot top part of the glacier that, of course, increases the melting even faster than if it's just the warming of the atmosphere, right? And so Switzerland, where I'm from originally, you might notice a little bit of an accent. This is what it looked like this last winter, right? Skiers who are trying to find some snow to go down. It's quite a depressing look. The reason why the area around it is green is because it's just not cold enough for the snow cannons to actually produce the snow that would be required to cover it all up.
And it just shows, it's such a sad picture to see this little strip, and people are still trying to ski. We're trying to hold on to the life that we've known.
So this is a kind of wait what thing, right? Where humans then do some wild stuff like taking helicopters to bring up the snow because the snow cannons no longer work, right? In preparation for a race, you can't do the race without the snow, so in comes the helicopters. These are kind of the desperate things that we then step into in these kind of moments. Winter Olympics, it's unclear where they're going to be. They can't find a place for 2030. They looked back at all the places that the Olympics had happened before, and only one, Sapporo, is actually a useful place at the moment. So things are happening. So we're going to take you into a kind of deep dive. We're moving into this idea of being on a different planet. First, we wanted to take a look at the signals. Now we're going to look at the background. This is going to be a little bit of an intense place still. And then we're going to look at, okay, now how does that inform what we must do and what we can do about it? So what is driving this crisis? We have a particular kind of lifestyle. It's really quite remarkable. We live in a way that allows us to do remarkable things. Look at where we all are at and how we're communicating at this.
So basically, as we know, to run the world that we have dug deep into the ground to get our various fossil fuels, and then we use them for everything that moves, for the industry that we've had, and then we use them, and then we put it up into the air.
Now, here's an interesting one, which is a real challenge if you think about net zero or even cutting that by 50% in the next 7 years, right? This is the reality of where the primary energy consumption comes from by source. So 85% of our energy sources are, basically hydrocarbons and then biomass that gets burned, right? That still puts the CO2 into the atmosphere. So only 15% are basically in the renewables place. So that's the challenge. This is the picture.
We need to see how big that challenge is about what we're facing.
In that process of producing all that energy, we're spewing 162 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into our atmosphere every 24 hours. Just extraordinary amounts of pollution, right? And what that has now done is it basically traps the equivalent of 600,000 first-generation nuclear bombs per day for 365 days a year, right? So every second we have 6 of these. Every second is the equivalent of 6 nuclear explosions, right? So what's challenging is that we're putting all that stuff into the atmosphere, and the planet can only reabsorb 40%. The other 60% remain in the atmosphere. They're just stuck up there. And so by now we have 1,000 billion tons, a trillion, basically 1,000 gigatons in the atmosphere.
So what this means is that even if we all were driving electric cars and that we're all charged by, right, they're all charged by solar, which our buildings have. Right. But even if we're doing that, there's still this trillion tons that are up there. So when we think about net zero, that's in terms of what we're emitting. But also, in addition to reducing emissions, that we're also needing to remove the carbon that's in there, because all these effects that we saw in our first slides, that's from what's already in the air. Yeah. That's not from what we're going to continue to put up each year.
So just to kind of give you a sense of the order of magnitude, and probably many of you have seen this slide before or this graphic before, that shows that for millions of years, we have basically, the atmosphere has had a CO2 concentration of between 170 parts per million, about 290 parts per million. So it's been fluctuating every 50,000 years or so, up and down, but sort of in that band between 170 and 290. And then in 1950, we broke through that ceiling, 300 parts per million, and we're now at 424.87. parts per million just the other day. That was the most recent statistic, and it showed that it had risen by over 3 parts per million, which it was a record. So even though we're talking about net zero, even though we're talking about we have to do this now, we are still seeing record increases of CO2 into the atmosphere. So it's so interesting to be a modern human, right? Because we have all this science, we have all this capacity to see what did the world actually look like 3 million years ago when things were at 400 parts per million.
Right. So the whole northern hemisphere had no ice-free. Sea levels were 60 feet higher. Florida completely underwater. So any of you who are in Florida, but all of us who are anywhere near a coast, beginning to imagine what that means for us. And so that the seas went 80 miles farther inland. So Maureen Ramo, who started the climate school at Columbia University in New York, has a great description of that. We're like, someone said, well, if that used to be so many feet, so much farther inland than it is now, why don't we see the ocean there now? And she said, well, it's like the frozen lasagna. It's frozen, you put it in the oven, you come back 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, it's still frozen. 20 minutes later, still frozen. Stop. But that you set the oven at the right temperature, you know what's going to happen to the lasagna. You know it's coming. You know the lasagna is going to cook.
So I think the point is there's a lag.
Yeah,
right? There's a lag.
And if you think back to where Herman showed a slide before, where it was that 40% of the where 40% of the CO2 was going into the ocean and 60% into the air. This is kind of saying still now a third of the CO2 that we are adding to the atmosphere, it still is going into oceans and getting converted into carbonic acid. So it doesn't stay CO2 in the water, it becomes acidic. And it makes the oceans acidify so much that at these rates, they're going to be 170% more acidic by the end of the century. And that's too acidic for 97% of the life in the ocean.
So the oceans are, we worry a lot about the atmosphere and things like that, but the ocean, and we're sitting right next to it at the moment, is really an incredibly important consideration for us to think about.
So we want to just take a breath, because we don't want to just go next slide, next slide, next slide. We think that when we hear that our normal day, our day of life, we're not trying to do something that's destructive, but that the way we've organized our day-to-day living is in the process of killing 97% of the life in the ocean.
Unless we do something
you want to
radical.
stop and take a breath and be able to take some of this in.
So we're not quite done yet. There's still a little bit more to think about in terms of our sort of reorientation to the fact that we're living on a different planet than we think we do, and that is tipping points, right? So
this is, I think, one of the pictures that for me made a huge difference and has been very moving, is to really see methane holes, because a lot of what we've looked at is that all of our human
Man-made
activities
stuff.
and our buildings and our transportation, how we've been putting this greenhouse gas up into the atmosphere. But what's happening is that as we're melting the permafrost, as the temperature's going up, land that's been frozen for millions and millions of years is suddenly thawing. And as it thaws, the greenhouse gas that's underground, that's still there, that hasn't gone into the atmosphere, is now exploding up out into the air, and it's letting itself out. It doesn't need us to go dig and bring it up, spend billions of dollars, bring it up, use it, and then we put it into the atmosphere. It's just going there directly.
Well,
and the reason why it's a tipping point, though, is that the more of the methane that comes up, the warmer it gets. The warmer it gets, more permafrost melts, more methane comes up. So it's a tipping point that actually has nothing to do with us. So our challenge is almost going to be, can we refreeze the permafrost? Can we get the carbon back to where it's been for those last 5 million years, so that the permafrost has a chance to refreeze and stop continuing these tipping points?
So Lisa pointed out that there's this emergence of, all this mobilization of methane and other carbon that is happening because permafrost is thawing, and an equivalent or similar process that she just described with these methane holes that pop and then are basically kind of explosive craters. We have these ponds. This is also happening, and what's really interesting about this is that these thaw ponds are increasing 43-fold over a 10-year period. So that tells you something, again, following Lisa's point about turning these tipping points, that there is a process going on that we need to address, right? That's part of what we now need to face. Antonio Guterres, at the opening just a few months ago of COP27, made the point that humanity is on a highway to climate hell, that we're in the fight for our lives and we're losing at the moment, right? That our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. So yes, these are really remarkable realities that few are fully aware of and few are yet facing. And that's where we want to link it to now shifting to saying, so what are we going to do, right? Once we have this kind of awareness and realize that,
So we're the first generation to know this, right?
Yeah.
Our parents didn't know all of this, our grandparents. So we're the first ones, but we're also the last generation to be able to do something about it. You saw the timelines that are getting talked about.
Yeah.
So we really have a very, very short time to keep ourselves out of that point of the tipping points, where the more it tips, the harder it is to get our climate that supports life as we know it, to get it back. So it's us.
So, and we have to do it at a speed and scale that's quite unimaginable at the moment, right? So we're sort of, this is part of this presentation and this conversation is about an appeal to all of us to step into this, right? To access parts of us that are capable to actually facing something at this kind of scale. So the question becomes, what actions? Once we have that awareness, what are we going to do? And this is where I want to introduce you to this idea of another planet. So the issue that we have in part is that we think we're still on this beautiful and familiar planet, right? What a remarkable, unbelievable reality, this blue marble with life, with this verdant, biosystem that is just, where else is it in this universe, right? It's just a remarkable reality. But the point of all that we have taken you through so far is that we're really finding ourselves now on another planet. We have to rethink what is it actually that we are on, right? If we landed on Mars, we would immediately say, wait a minute, we can do something here. We need to build this. We need to make this air acceptable for life. We need to make it so that plants can grow. We need whatever, right? We go to work. And this is our appeal here, is that by looking at this a little differently, the question then becomes, can we innovate our way back to the Earth that we used to have, right? How can we turn Earth into this livable planet again by reducing what we're putting up, by removing what's already up there, by cooling it actively? Remember the Greenland glaciers, by adapting to it, creating all kinds of adaptive strategies and implementing totally different ways of doing that, and by restoring the biosystems so that we can have life again. So reducing, we're familiar with. Removing, there are remarkable numbers of really interesting companies, interesting developments. We're going to go deeper into that, and I think there's a lot for Johnson Controls in that space as well, right? Cooling, again, Johnson Controls may have a very active part to actually participating in active, proactive cooling. What is it going to look like? Over to you guys. Let's make that part of your mission. Is how can you do something with buildings that they actively, become help cool the planet? How do we adapt? Some really interesting possibilities for building there, right? It's going to look very different, in both in storm regions or on the water, in other places, and then actively restoring. How can we turn roofs into landscapes? How can we turn the landscapes around our buildings into something that really is attractive to the bees, the birds, the various other living organs? So now we're going to take you into, what are we going to do now, right? If we see ourselves on that other planet, if we really take it seriously, how do we step into that?
So in a way, we're moving into a new era, right? So here's, we had agriculture, industrial, digital eras, right? But we're hitting a wall. We're in this hyper digital, but we're hitting a wall. This is in Phoenix, outside of Phoenix, Arizona. Sometimes the wall's hitting us. But we're really in this space where our technologies have been so amazing, and AI is just kicking in, and ChatGPT, and we're so excited about all these things. But also, as we hit this wall, there's a whole new era that's coming. And so it's not just agriculture, industrial, digital, but we're moving into a regenerative era and a regenerative economy. A lot's being written about it, lots of wonderful books. So,
which is another signal. I mean, I think there could be, a George Oliver version of this book too. And
what's
leaders
the role?
are stepping
so
in,
what
right?
is the role of buildings and building structures in doing this? But really looking at how to end the climate crisis in one generation, how to avoid a climate disaster. How do we need speed and scale? Speed and Scale is written by John Doerr, and he and his wife, Ann Doerr, have just made one of the largest donations to a university ever. $1.1 billion for a climate school to be at Stanford, and many other companies and individuals contributed. So there's another $560 billion. So they got $1.65 billion to launch this new school on climate at Stanford.
So a bunch of banks, actually, in this case, are starting to really speak about, what is the size of this challenge. B of A says it's $150 trillion battle, and what we are saying is, well, if it's $150 trillion battle, it's basically $150 trillion economy.
If somebody's putting that money in, somebody's going to get that $150 trillion.
And so that's, that money is going to move into what we just addressed about reducing technologies that reduce, remove, cool, adapt, and restore. And that's, again, the appeal to Johnson Controls. Right now, you're rightly and very happily focusing on reducing, reducing emissions. But there's a whole set of other opportunities that are going to be profoundly transformational and very economically valuable as well, right? And so
And we've transformed before so that we don't feel hopeless about how big the challenge is. This was a picture on the left from 1900. This was Fifth Avenue in New York City, where there was all horses and there was one car. 13 years later, it's all cars and one horse. And think about the infrastructure, the manufacturing, the design. Think about what all had to happen in that short span of time.
So just quickly now back to this new regenerative economy. Mark Carney, when he was the head of the Bank of England, said firms that ignore the climate crisis will go bankrupt. Right. Again, I'm reminded of George Oliver's idea of the license to operate. You don't have a license to operate unless you step into that. So it's a time for moonshots. It's a time to really step in. Doug McMillan said, as a society, we're at an inflection point. If we don't act now, we may not have the opportunity to do something later. And so fully committed to kind of an orientation away from sustainability to regeneration. It's a shift now.
Google is talking about that as well. They've already offset their entire carbon legacy, but they're wanting to do more than just offset. They're committing to be carbon-free operations by 2030. So not putting carbon up and offsetting it somewhere else, being carbon-free 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. And that's going to create new industries and new jobs.
And what's interesting is when companies talk about these kind of things and look at Google, right? That's their newest building. It changes their relationship to Johnson Controls, right? When a company makes that commitment, it changes how you approach them, how you manage that account, what you sell to them, who you engage with in those companies.
This is solar roof that they have.
It's a huge solar roof.
It's going to have one of the largest geothermal pile systems in North America.
So it's like the whole building is basically a heat pump.
And because it's in California, they're also paying attention to water.
Right.
So Microsoft, highest levels, president, CFO, CEO, all looking at making a commitment to carbon negative by 2030. They're going to remove their historical carbon by 2050. Everything this has ever been there from the first day they were founded. So if there's greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, it did not come from Microsoft. They don't know how to do it. So there's $1 billion climate innovation fund that they're doing to work with projects or people who have good solutions at hand to be able to fund those.
And again, because they don't know how to do it, they have formed this consortium in particular called Transform to Net Zero with Maersk, Starbucks, Mercedes-Benz, Danone. And, it sounds like a broken record, but I think there's a Johnson Controls opportunity when you see these kind of consortia to step in and say, wait a minute, we have a relationship with Nike, we have a relationship with Danone, whatever, right? There's got to be many companies on this list here that are your customers. And how do you participate then to help them actually achieve what they're claiming they want to achieve?
They all have buildings, they all have ongoing operations.
Right. So there you are, right? Your CEO says, it's not just urgent for our future, this climate action, it's becoming a license to operate. He affirms that while we're increasing emissions by 11% currently, we're telling ourselves that in the next 7 years we have to bring it down by 50%, right? So right now we're over 100% off target for 2030. But then he basically says, look, that's where our opportunity lies. That's where we, as a company that is can decarbonize building, can become much more aggressive, much more active to actually achieve that and bring about massive win. Exactly.
Well, because 40%, I think this in the middle, the 40% of the global energy emissions, it actually comes from building emissions.
Yeah. So there you are. You are pursuing it with a whole kind of program called Open Blue. You all much more familiar with it, but we just want to acknowledge that you're on track, right? You are actually participating in stepping into, this other planet. Now, again, our hunch is that as you pick up on that perspective of another planet, that really we need to get even more aggressive than looking for net zero. It opens up huge territories for activity and for action. So what we're seeing, back to us coming from Silicon Valley, is startups. Startups are really, really big signal of where the world is going. So recently, companies like Apple and JP Morgan and this group Frontiers that has, I think, McKinsey in it, and Meta, and a whole bunch of companies.
Stripe.
They're putting in hundreds of millions of dollars to basically support efforts to engage startups, to fund startups into this new space.
Bill Gates is putting in $1.5 billion into climate projects, and just look at breakthrough energy ventures, but getting a lot of other leaders in all around the world. So we've got Jeff Bezos from Amazon, got a lot of the main names that we've heard of, like Khosla Ventures, Richard Branson from Virgin, Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn. So all coming together, where now business leaders are starting to say, and to pledge money for the solutions. So these are some of the solutions. It's all online. So for Breakthrough Energy Ventures, if you're interested in energy startups, each one of these is a live link, and you can go and see the kinds of things they're funding.
Again, a huge opportunity for Johnson Controls, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, these are all potential collaborators, companies that can help actually step into these things.
Elon Musk doing the $100 million prize for carbon removal.
Yeah. And so what we're seeing is, climate tech is now the hottest corner in the VC business in Silicon Valley. We've seen a 50% increase in 1 quarter in climate tech. Just a year ago, we now see what we've seen here is an 89% rise in funding between 21 and 22. It's a little bit less so now, given economic realities, but nonetheless, it's just massive, right? What's happening with all that money and where it's going. This is interesting. Unicorns, that's a company that has achieved $1 billion valuation in 2015 and 2016. There was 1 in each year. By 2021, there were 28. And so it's explosive what's going on there.
So there's lots of incubators and accelerators. Plug and Play is one from Silicon Valley spreading around the world. And they also have specialty accelerators. So they have real estate and construction, and these show some of the startups. Again, on the Plug and Play Tech Center, I think .com is their website. If you look up Plug and Play, you can see that. Look at their real estate and construction startups, but they also have energy startups. They have a whole energy accelerator. They have a sustainability accelerator. They have materials.
We would be super happy to introduce you to them. They're a really remarkable, interesting organization, and easy to visit, to be part of.
You can click on any of their startups. You can even see some of the pitches online. In Silicon Valley alone, there's already 9 accelerators just around exploring different kinds of energy.
Speaking of energy, there's a bunch of startups in Silicon Valley related to nuclear. One is called Oklo, and they take waste energy from existing nuclear power plants and basically in the process reduce the radioactivity from tens of thousands of years to a few hundred years, and basically take the leftover energy that's still in that and produce quite a few years of energy.
And it's too small to explode.
Small footprint.
But it's too small to explode.
It's a much safer way
people.
To go. Right?
Other thing with startups, Air Miners is airminers.org. They're a group of people who are wanting to go get the resources out of the air and use those. So mining the air. An example at the top, you can see Novo Nutrients is one of the startups. It takes microorganisms in the smokestacks of the buildings, and they ferment all the greenhouse gas into proteins, and the proteins are fed to fish and fish farms, and we end up with wonderful salmon on the plate. Other companies, Made of Air is working on putting the carbon into building materials, because as we're drawing it down, what are we going to do with it? Mm-hmm. You can just put it in the ground and hide it, but you can also use it for things. So we can make building facades, we can make diamonds and jewelry, or vodka.
So just a few more things, and then we're going to wrap it up. But Idea Lab is doing some interesting stuff. I thought particularly the Energy Vault was interesting. It's a gravity battery, and actually the first one they built is in Switzerland. It's a sort of AI-driven tower that pulls up weights as the sun shines, from solar energy, and then during the night uses those weights to basically return the energy into the grid. Much cheaper than any other form of battery. 3.5 cents compared to lithium-ion batteries, about 25 cents. They're building a huge battery right now in China. It's, again, something that might be super interesting for Johnson Controls. I could imagine it could be an interesting collaboration. Another really interesting development that we're seeing nearly explosively is the development of pyrolysis and gasification machines that take inputs like manure, but food processing and other carbon intensive waste materials, and turns it into products, into also biochar, which is basically a way to turn it into a kind of black carbon that can be then sequestered into the ground, and in agriculture can actually contribute to improving the quality of the soil. So soil health can be improved with these kind of biomaterials. But we expect that companies like Johnson Controls is going to get much more involved in that to help communities to pyrolyze their wastes and capture that CO2 instead of putting it back into the atmosphere to, stabilize it and then use it.
So on corporate campuses and communities and cities in agriculture.
Yeah, so. Right. It should be interesting. So, with all that, as we think about being on a different on this other planet, with having to not just reduce, but also remove, cool, and adapt and restore, the question or the suggestion that we have is that this is actually a huge opportunity for Johnson Controls, that it moves from net zero to beyond net zero, that there's a beyond net zero possibility here that is hugely productive and challenging, of course, but could be very, very
we'll try to take just a minute or two to show you what it looks like when companies get engaged and really see this and get excited and make a vision for themselves. So how to create that, what's the big picture strategy? And it can be at a company level, but it can be a division, a team, it can be a supply chain that say, here's our strategy that we're going to do together, here's how we're going to innovate and collaborate with each other, this is how we're going to engage all the people that need to get engaged in order to do that and to connect.
So these are the three practices we suggest any one of you can now step into, right? Is that you can take your team away to the side and say, hey, how are we dealing with that as a team, and see the possibility together. And once you see that, and let's go here, that's
then this is one of the ways about, this is kind of a picture of that strategy that we talked about before. Right. How do you create a map? How do you really get a shared agreement with whichever the groups of people and stakeholders you're wanting to engage in that, or as a leadership team?
And these are just such important conversations to have among yourselves, to settle with each other, just like these two characters who are kind of discussing what's going on in the world, to kind of come to a kind of calming effect that says we can see it, we're going to do something about it. We can not only look at our footprint, which is kind of the net zero orientation, is to say how can we reduce global greenhouse gases, what is our footprint, but to step into it more actively, more proactively, to say what's our handprint, what are the kind of highest impact actions that we as a team can take, we as an organization can take, we as a company can take to help remove, cool, adapt, and restore our planet. And then that gives you a voice, right? I mean, again, we heard George Oliver basically have a voice, do an article in Fortune, make presentations, and that's what is possible once you really embrace that.
So that's about how do you get the strategy, how do we get people on board, what are some of the innovation practices? We work with CoStar, so we have a book about it, but also how do we get people to pitch and make a value proposition? If you want, we can send you some of the templates for it. Once you have these ideas and you want to take them to the group that you want to convince them to work with you on it, or to fund it, or to give you the time to work on it, how do you pitch your idea? And then there's also we work with a company, there's a number of these platforms out there.
Right.
We've worked
we may
a lot
even have one, we don't know.
Yeah, right. With Idea Scale, to have where people can put their ideas up, where leaders can say, here's a campaign. You can run a campaign, have a competition. People can put their ideas up, they can put their co-stars or value propositions or pitch up online. People really network about it to make each other's pitches stronger. We worked with a company recently, international, at Zura Rosa, and they had companies that were like
it was a company with 2,000 people and 508 participated, so a quarter of the company participated.
But they were across different countries. Yeah. So one group would say, in Holland, they'd go, this is something we want to do. And another group in Spain would say, oh, well, we've actually just started doing that. And they wouldn't have known that they actually had these solutions. They were thinking about the same things. So it helped people really network and connect with each other by having a platform online in order to do that with their innovation ideas.
The chief sustainability officer was actually quite blown away by it. It felt like it was a culture change, right? Because instead instead of just having these this like her talking about it and trying to set up certain things. All of a sudden, the whole company could participate, and as you just said, across language barriers at all.
And you may already be using things like this, but we just want to show you how it's spreading and how companies are starting to do it.
So remember, the first one is strategy, is like, where are we going? How are we seeing the world? The second is, how do we innovate into it? But of course, it's also emotionally hard at times. And so how do we face this reality together? How do we move from a place of fear to a place of courage? How do we?
So what happens is that a lot of times we'll see things and there'll be climate articles we'll read, and then at the end it'll have a happy statement like, well, of course we're going to do this. Yeah. So how do you hold both of these at the same time? How do you look at this? And at times you may feel afraid, you might feel hopeless. It might be lots of emotions about it. But at the same time, if you're an innovator, or a leader, that you can say, it makes you know that I have to have courage. It's exciting in a way. You can have creativity. You can get determined, have people be engaged. But it doesn't mean you don't feel the first one. So how do you hold both of those at the same time? And you may notice that you kind of go back and forth. But, the ones we need to step in are that even if you do feel these emotions on the other side, because that's natural, when you look at all those tipping points and things that you will see in the news when you see the
probably
red
have
sky,
experienced it as we talked. Right?
But the people that we need are the ones that can feel that and still step in.
And what we're finding is, what's really interesting is when humans are facing a catastrophe, they do naturally step in. It does generate kind of an upwelling of ingenuity, of coming together, of helping each other out. So. And
finally, just as a closing, why not make it beautiful? So LAGI is Land Art Generator Initiative, LAGI, and it makes competitions. And so this was one around solar or wind energy. What about wave energy and solar combined? What about something that was part of a park and kind of playful, but also still solar and energy generating, and just capture the spirit of the wind? Because that's what we've got a lot of work to do, and we need that.
Well, I think that's, again, another really interesting message to Johnson Controls, right? That there's sort of a culture shift that can be represented in a built environment in a really powerful kind of way.
And we're the ones. I mean, we've known this. I've known this since I was an undergraduate, really, that these things were coming. We've known things are coming, and now they're here. And now we're at the time where actions have to be taken. So now it's us. We are the ones.
So with that, join us on another planet.